So one of the class I'm going to teach is about some of the things I do as part of my hobby. And I do costuming as one of the things I do. And one of the things I've learned how to make are fabric buttons. Um, these were the sorts of buttons that were used starting in the 13th century on into the 14th, 15th, and 16th century, although in later period they were using all different kinds of buttons. But these are fabric buttons, and almost everybody can make these using the fabric left over from making their garment. There's always some fabric left over. And so this is a nice way to use your fabric to make buttons that match your garb. So again, what I generally use is a 2-inch circle of fabric. I start out with a square, and then I have a round template that I use to make my circles, and it's not a real fancy thing. It is the bubble from a gumball machine. I use one of these, and I lay that over my fabric. The fabric's sticking to my fingers. I lay that over the fabric. I make my circle. Then once I have a circle, I can sometimes just use that, since wool is kind of sticky, put it over my next piece of fabric and trim around the corners until I have my circles. And I have a lot of circles. I probably won't use all of these in the class. Generally you'll want to cut more circles than you think you're going to need, more circles than the buttons you need to make, because in the process of making the buttons, there might be some that don't turn out quite the way you want, and some you may not be able to use. So go ahead and always start with more than you think you need. And Isabel has posted a link to the handout, and I will give the love to the kitties once I let them back down, or once I go back up and see them. So we've got your circle of fabric. That's one of the things you're going to need. Again, this is a 2-inch circle. We'll make a button of about this size. Not sure what to use for scale here, but this is my hand. This is the button. These are all buttons that are made using that 2-inch circle. And if you've taken my class before, you've seen this piece of fabric. This is what I use to demonstrate stitching the buttons onto the edge. Depending on your garment and what you want, you will want to experiment with the fabric you have and what size button you want. Now, I will say you would want to make your buttons before you make your buttonholes in your garment, because it's a lot easier to tailor your buttonhole to fit your button than it is to do it the other way around, to make a button that fits a buttonhole. It's a lot more work. So pro tip, make your buttons, then plan your buttonholes. So the other materials you're going to need are a really strong thread. I will be using linen thread, and this is just a nice sturdy linen thread. It's really thick. You might not want to use that for really fine fancy garb. You might want to use a reeled silk or an upholstery thread. This is also a really good thread. This is Americana quilting thread, and that's nice and strong. You need a really strong thread because, as you'll see a little later, we're going to be putting a lot of tension on that. We're going to be really pulling and sculpting on this thread to make the buttons. So you're going to need a sturdy thread. You're going to want something to dress your thread with. I have some beeswax here. I will be running the thread through the beeswax to kind of groom the thread. That helps prevent tangling. If you don't have beeswax, or you can get other kinds of thread groom at the fabric store. You can also just use a plain old bar of soap. If you just have a bar of soap, nice dry bar of soap, you can run your thread through that. So I'm going to go ahead and get a piece of thread ready. Now the class handout says 18 inches. That might be a little long. 15 inches is also a good length. You do need a long piece of thread, because not only is this going to be the thread you will use to make the button, this is also the thread you're going to use to sew the button onto the garment. So I'm just going to go ahead and prepare that. And hi, sis. She says, I feel like my sister has turned into Nancy Zeman. That is a pretty high compliment. Thank you, sis. So anyway, I've waxed my thread and it's ready to be put in the needle. This is a needle with a really large eye because I'm using a really thick thread. So I've got a needle with a really large eye. This is an embroidery needle with a big eye. You just have to use a needle that fits your thread. If you're using a heavy thread, you need a needle with a big eye. Just makes it a lot easier to thread the needle. So I've got it threaded. I'm going to make a knot in the end of the needle. Any questions so far? Are we all on the same page here? Somebody has asked again, where are the cats? The cats are upstairs. I gave them some crunchy food so that they would be upstairs and not need to supervise me. Okay, so I've got my nice prepared thread. I've got my little circle of fabric. The first thing that we're going to do is we're going to run a row of gathering stitches along the edge of the circle of fabric. Now I will say that I did not come up with this technique. I'm going to interrupt myself. I did not come up with this technique. I learned this perusing the internet. This is one technique that I have found on some different websites. There's also some tutorials on YouTube that show how to make a cloth button from a square of fabric. So you would start with a square of fabric. That I haven't mastered that yet. I haven't really dabbled into that, but got my circle. And I'm going to put the needle in through the right side, starting out on the right side. I'm going to begin and end with the needle on the right side of the fabric. And I'm going to go in not quite a quarter of an inch. And I'm just going to do a basting stitch. And I don't want my stitches to be too big. I don't want them to be too small. You kind of have to experiment a little bit with what works best for you. It kind of depends on the fabric that you're using. This is a pretty heavy fabric. It's kind of a heavy wool, but you'll see I'm just doing just a simple basting stitch around the edge. And again, I started on with the knot and the thread on the right side of the fabric, and I'm just going to go around. How many of you are actually playing from home, trying to follow along? Anybody? Okay, so I'm going to keep on going around. And I'm going to end with my thread or my needle, again, coming out to the right side of the fabric. So I've got my little... Okay, Adelaide is playing from home. So, all right, so
hearts and thumbs.
I see that. Okay, so the next step is to pull this up into a little pouch. So you'll see it's pulled up into a little pouch. Now, if I were going to stuff this button with something like, you can use a little bit of wood or bone or horn. You can stuff it with a little bit of cotton. This is like a little dowel plug you can get at the hardware store. I have put these in buttons. You can put little wooden beads inside buttons. You can put little discs of horn. If you were going to, you can just use more little fabric scraps. But if you were going to stuff it with something, you wouldn't want to pull it up so tight. You would want to have it a little more loose, because the next step is to kind of mash this flat. If you were stuffing it with something, and I'll describe this in a minute, because these little gathers form the stuffing of the button. But if you were going to stuff it with something else, it would make the next step a little different. So once you've got it all pulled up into a little pouch, you're going to want to mash it flat. And you mash it flat in such a way so that you've got a smooth side, smooth round side, and then the other side has the gathers. Now, kind of going back to what I was saying about if you're going to stuff the button with something else or have a little insert, you would not pull it up so tight, and you would mash it more flat so that the gathers are more flat on the inside. I'm not sure I'm showing it very well with this one, so that it can wrap around your core. But for this button, it's going to be a self-stuffed button. So I'm going to pull it up tight so that it's like a little pouch. And then I'm going to take a back stitch. And that back stitch, and people say, what's a back stitch? I'm just going to insert the thread, make sure that's all pulled up tight, and then I'm going to pull that stitch tight so that it doesn't come unraveled. Okay. All right, so then, as I said before, we mash it flat. And this is where you're going to start sculpting, because I am pressing and pushing the wool so that it's making my little flat thing with the gathers on one side, almost like a little tam, almost like a little hat. So are we all at that point, those playing at home? Mash it flat.
Don't hold it quite so close to the camera. It gets a little blurry.
Okay. I've been told it's getting a little blurry. Okay, so the next step, once you've got it mashed flat, is that you're going to then take your thread, which is still attached, and then you're going to start doing a basting stitch along the edge of your little circle that you've made. And you're not going to run the thread this way up and down through the edge. You're going to run it around the edge. You're going to do little basting stitches around the edge. Audrey says Self-Stuffed Buttons is her next band name. All right, so I am running. She may not have wanted me to share that with everybody. So I'm just going to run my basting stitch. I'm going to put the needle, just insert it into that fold and run it out.
Can you see your thumb or your finger right now?
That's going to happen. So everybody see what I'm doing. I'm just running the needle and doing a gathering stitch all around. Again, stitches that aren't too big, aren't too small. I can't really tell you exactly how big the stitches need to be. It's just kind of trial and error depending on the fabric that you're using. This is the boring part. Okay, I think I've gone almost all the way around. It's kind of hard to see.
Are the steps the same in the fabric is linen?
The steps are the same if the fabric is linen. Now, if you are using linen fabric, which is thinner than this wool that I'm using, you may want to use more than one layer of linen or you may want, if you want the outer part to be linen, you maybe can back it with some wool, but it's the same steps no matter what fabric you're using. You're going to run the gathering stitches along the outside, mash it flat, and then run another row of gathering stitches. Okay, I think that's all the way around. Okay, now here's the challenging part. Because you've just run that row of stitches, and now you're going to want to gather it up so that the outside of this is pulled so that it wraps around the little gathers.
Would you use a thinner thread with linen?
You would not use a thinner thread with linen. You would still use, because you're still going to be pulling and sculpting. You're still going to be putting some tension on this thread. So as you can see, I am pulling this around so that the edge I just gathered, I'm trying to wrap it around this little core, making what looks like a little raspberry. Everybody with me? So,
are there any fabrics entirely unsuited for buttons?
Really loosely woven fabric would be more difficult to use to make buttons, because as you are pulling on the thread, it can break threads in the fabric. So I am still pushing and sculpting. The nice thing about the wool is that it's kind of pliable and stretchy and bendable, and so you can manhandle it a lot and sculpt your buttons. If you've done your gathering stitches correctly, it's going to make a nice little raspberry there. And now I'm going to really get brutal with it, because I really want these little raw edges enclosed. That's the nice thing about when you're making these buttons, is that the raw edges are completely enclosed. In theory, that's how it should be. So I'm going to take the point of my scissors and kind of coerce the little raw ends. I'm going to push. You could use a chopstick, you could use a pencil. Just kind of push, and sculpt. And at this point, this is where I have been known to have button failure, because there have been some times, no matter how I am pushing and pulling and trying to sculpt this button, the raw edges do not go in completely. And if you're finding that you're having trouble with that, when you run those gathering stitches around the edge, maybe you, instead of running it directly on the fold after you've mashed it flat, instead of running it directly on the fold, maybe just a little bit inside that fold to make it easier for it to wrap. So I think I've got this about as mashed as I'm going to get it. And I want this to stay gathered. We're not done yet, but because I do want this to stay gathered, I'm going to try to keep this pulled tight, and I'm just going to take another little back stitch so this doesn't come loose, and I'm just gonna catch a little corner, bring the needle through. I'm not gonna do a full knot, I'm just gonna do a little back stitch to help that. Okay, so now for those playing at home, we're gonna continue sculpting this button and making it more firm. So let's see, I've got a question. Could you move the original basting stitches closer to the edge to combat that issue? You can move the original basting stitches closer to the edge if you find you've got more stuffing in the middle than you can enclose. And probably nothing's to say that you couldn't trim it down with scissors, but I think that's a little more iffy. All right, so now the next step, I've got my thread, and again, I'm still not cutting the thread off. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take the thread and I'm going to run it through a little fold on the other side, but not directly across. I'm going to off center it a little bit so that it's not quite directly across. And I'll show you why in just a second. And I'm going to pull that tight. And that continues to sculpt this button. It pulls those edges closer together and encloses those little raw edges of the center a little bit better. Then I'm going to take another stitch, again, not directly across where I was just, but I'm going to run the needle up through a little fold, not quite on the other side. What we're going to do is kind of make a little star pattern. We're going to kind of make a little star pattern with these stitches. So as we're going through the edge, I don't know if you can see that well.
I'm not sure if it's just me or if you stop.
So, and then I'm going to do that again. I'm going to catch a little pucker on the other side with my thread, with my needle, and I'm going to pull that tight. And I'm going to do this several times, and this will continue to compress the fabric and make the button firmer and firmer, and it will compress the size a little bit. And this is where you will also find some, if your fabric isn't quite sturdy enough, this is where you're going to find out if you're going to pull threads out. So I'm stitching and sculpting and stitching and sculpting and making that bottom a little tighter. I don't know if there's any way to get that to focus a little better. Can everybody see what I'm doing? Any questions about what I'm doing? Okay, Adelaide says, the button I am making is using a super fraying polyester fabric, and the less than 1/4 of an inch from the edge for the first basting, which worked like a charm. Maybe he's not working like a charm for this one? I don't know. Okay. Again, with the fabric that you're working with, you're going to have to experiment. You're not going to make the perfect button right off the bat. You're going to have to experiment with the technique and see what works for this particular fabric, what doesn't. What's going to make the size of button you want. And what's going to work. Okay, so this is about, this is pretty well sculpted. To my liking. I'm going to take one more stitch. Take one more stitch. And now I've got a really nice firm round wool button. Looks pretty good to me. So now I am going to knot my thread off. So I'm just going to catch a couple of threads. And I'm going to run my needle through that loop. I'm going to knot it off. And just because I'm a little paranoid, I'm going to do that again. I'm going to knot it for a second time. I'm going to catch a thread and knot it. And there is my finished button. For those of you playing along at home, I hope you've gotten this far. You have a button too. This video will be available to watch after we're done here. It will still be a public video on my feed, and hopefully I'll find a way to share it with people who are not on Facebook, so they'll be able to hopefully learn how to make a fabric button too. So now that we have our button, a couple more questions to answer. One is, I said earlier that you need to make your buttons before you make your buttonholes, because it is easier to make the buttonhole fit your button than the other way around, to make a button to fit a buttonhole. So the way that you measure how big your buttonhole needs to be is you get a piece of narrow ribbon. Got something here. And you wrap it snugly around the button. You kind of go around the equator of your button. I'll get my hand out of the way here in a second. You wrap it snugly around your button and you pinch it really firmly because you want a buttonhole that your button will go through, but not a buttonhole that it goes through too easily. So you want to hold it pretty firmly. Then you remove the button. So you've got this loop. Then you mash that loop flat. So the distance between the fold in the ribbon and where you have pinched or pinned is the size of the buttonhole that you need to make. If that makes sense. Because that way you know that the button will go through that buttonhole, but it won't be too big, won't be too small. Okay. I will show you the garment that I have, and a lot of you have seen me wear this. This is a hood that I have. It's a button front hood, and I sometimes call it the Force because it's got a light side and it's got a dark side. Ha, 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 ha. The nice thing about these buttons and the way the buttons are placed, and that's the next topic to discuss, is how you sew them on. Buttons of this type are more often than not, from what we see in the surviving clothing, are stitched right on the edge. They're stitched right on the edge of the fabric, which is different than modern button placement, where the buttons go in a little bit from the edge to provide a little bit of overlap between the edges so you don't see what's underneath. So these buttons are stitched to the edge of the fabric, and this helps make this garment reversible. I can wear the dark side out and still be able to button it up. I can wear the light side out and be able to button it up. So that's a nice thing about this type of button placement. You can make a garment reversible. Let me show you the buttonholes. These are not beautiful buttonholes. Medieval buttonholes frequently weren't beautiful buttonholes. You'll notice that they are perpendicular to the edge of the fabric. And they are, let me see if I can zoom in a little bit. I will. I'll show both sides. So you'll see the stitches don't completely cover the fabric. You see that a lot in medieval buttonholes. The raw edge is not completely covered. You'll see a diagram if you have the class handout. You'll see a diagram of the stitches, how you do the stitch. These are not beautiful buttonhole stitches. I will say that. I am not the world's greatest hand sewer. I am getting better at it. But when I made this, this was actually supposed to be just a test. This was supposed to be a sample garment. It was not supposed to be the thing, but it ended up being the thing because I liked how it turned out. The other thing about medieval buttonholes versus modern buttonholes, with a modern buttonhole that's done on a machine, you stitch the buttonhole with your zigzag stitch or your automatic buttonhole stitch, and then you cut the buttonhole open. With a medieval buttonhole, you cut the buttonhole open and then you finish it with your hand sewing, with your hand stitching. And regardless of whether you're making a modern buttonhole or a medieval buttonhole, one of the greatest ways to cut it open is with a buttonhole chisel. And this is a little modern buttonhole chisel made by Clover. It's very sharp. It came with a little block of wood. And what you do is where you mark your buttonhole where you want it to be, and you set the chisel where you have the mark, and then you push it or tap it slightly with a little mallet, and that cuts the buttonhole very precisely. This very sharp, which is why I keep it in this little sleeve that it came with, because it's sharp. So then you cut your buttonhole, stitch it up, and then you will mark where your buttons go on the opposite edge of the fabric, because of course you want your buttonholes and your buttons to mate up evenly. And I will show you how to stitch the buttons on, because it's not very complicated. But one thing that's a little different is with these buttons, you'll see that each one of them has a little neck of thread. It's called a shank. You want your buttons to have a little bit of a shank so that when the buttonhole goes over it, the edges of the buttonhole can meet as closely as possible under the button. That makes sure that the button doesn't come undone. If you don't have enough of a shank and the edges of the buttonhole don't quite meet under the button, it's a lot easier for that button to pop out through the buttonhole, and you won't stay buttoned, and that would be bad. Especially if what you're wearing is not a hood, if it is a body garment, or it's your sleeves, if you have buttons running from your elbow to your wrist on your sleeves or up and down, you want your buttons to stay buttoned. So do be sure they have a little bit of a shank. And that shank should be about as deep as the edge of your fabric. You don't want it to be too long so the button flops around too much, but you want it so that when you do button it, I'll button a few of these. So that when you button it, your buttons are nice and just sitting right there on the top.
Is the chisel double beveled?
Had the question, is the chisel double beveled? It is not. It is only beveled on one side. So it's, let me look. I lied. The chisel is double beveled. It's got a bevel on both sides. There we go. I think a lot of wood chisels only have a bevel on one side, and you can use a wood chisel. If you have a very thin, narrow wood chisel, you can use a wood chisel as well as this specialty chisel. As long as it's sharp and as long as it's the width of your buttonhole, it'll work. Just make sure that you're tapping it into some wood underneath, a little piece of wood, instead of into your table or into something else. All right, any other questions at the moment before I show you how to stitch the button on? Any other questions? I'll wait for a second since I know there's a lag. Okay, well, I'll pause if a question pops in.
How do you make the shank of the button?
How do you make the shank of the button? That's what I'm getting ready to show you right now. And I'm just going to use this thing. This is not an actual garment. This is a sleeve part that I took off of a tunic, and it has an edge. And I just use this in my classes to demonstrate how to sew on the buttons. These are the buttons that I have made in every previous class that I have taught. I have taught this class several times. So I'm going to put this new button that I just made about the same distance. This is a nice spacing of these buttons. They're not quite touching, and that's a very common feature. You'll have buttons that are very densely packed on your garment. So I'm going to regroom the thread. I'm going to run this through my wax some more to make sure it's nice and ready to sew with, because as we made the button, that wore some of the wax off of the thread. La la la.
Cat toys.
Yes, cat toys. Danglies, dangly cat toys. Okay, so I've got my button and my needle. I am going to run the needle through the edge of the garment. Just going to run that through, just the very edge. I'm not catching too much of the edge. And I'm going to pull this up, and then I'm going to take the thread from the other side, and I'm going to run it back up into one of the little folds at the bottom of the button. Just going to run that thread right through one of the little folds. And this is where you're going to determine how big your shank is. I know I want my shank to be about the same as all the other ones. So I'm letting the button dangle just, let me see if we can give it just that much. Again, I always say not quite a quarter of an inch. So if you really want a number, say 3/16 of an inch. Not quite a quarter of an inch. So now that I've got that about the length I want, it's flopping a little bit, I'm going to take the thread and I'm going to run it back through the fold of the fabric. Then when I come back up, I'm going to run the thread through another little fold at the bottom of the button. I try to grab like the 4 cardinal points of the button. I try to grab it in 4 different places. I don't need to run it into the button more than that because this is a really sturdy thread. It's going to make a really sturdy connection. And so again, I'm making sure that I leave a little bit of thread, about my 3/16 of an inch, that I'm not pulling the button closer. I'm going to run it through the edge of the fabric again.
So did you run in on the inside or of the finished seam?
I am running it through the edge of the seam. I've got a fold on the edge of my seam. I am running the needle just through the edge, just boom, through the edge. And then up into the button. And let's just pretend I've done this 4 times. I've only done it 3 times. But actually this, even 3 times, is going to be really sturdy. It's going to be a really sturdy connection. So now I'm going to run the thread through the fold one more time. And this is where I'm going to finish my shank. So I've already got these, let me see if I can zoom in a little bit. I've already got these threads that are not all tied together, going from the fold into the button. And this is where I'm going to make the shank. I've gone through that fold one more time. Make sure I'm not pulling that too close in. Then I'm going to take the thread and I'm going to start wrapping it around those threads to bind them together. And I'm going to wrap up to the button, and then I'm going to wrap down from the button back to the fold. There's my thread shank. Oh, come on. There's my thread shank. It's not the most beautiful thread shank I've ever made. And then I'm going to knot off the fabric. I'm going to pick up a thread in the fold. Whoops. I didn't leave enough thread to make a loop. I know this is a little out of focus. So I'm gonna knot the thread off. And because I'm really paranoid, I will knot it again. You probably don't need to make 2 knots. I make 2 knots. I broke my thread. The thread that I picked up snapped. Okay, so I'm knotting this off again. So now I'm finally ready to cut this thread off. Let me zoom back out. Zoom back out. I'm ready to finally cut the thread off, and I need to actually rethread my needle because that popped out. If you just cut the thread off now, you will end up with a little tail that maybe you don't want to see. This is why I'm going to get coronavirus, because I can't stop touching my face or putting my fingers in my mouth. My husband says he's going to keep me in the basement for a week. That's 2 weeks. So then if I want to hide this thread after I cut it off, I'm going to take the needle. I'm going to insert it into the fold right at the base here. And I'm going to run the needle along the fold and pop it out a little ways away. You'll see. I'm going to pull the needle through. So then the thread's coming up a little ways away from the button. then when I clip it off, that tail is invisible. And I have a very firmly stitched button. That's not coming off for a while. All right. So now we have made a button. We've talked about buttonholes. We have attached the button. Any questions before we're done? If you're playing along at home, you are able to watch this video again. If you have any questions, and especially if you're seeing this video after the live feed, if you have any questions, please go ahead and ask your question in the comments, and I'll do my best to answer. If I need an illustration, I'll try to add an illustration that will hopefully answer your question better than I've described it here. I really do hope that you learned how to make a button and a little bit more about medieval buttons. I've been really happy to do this. This is kind of a way that we can still share knowledge even though the events that we've planned have been canceled. We're not able to learn from each other in person, so hopefully this virtual class space will be good for you and for other people who want to teach and other people who want to learn. So I guess that wraps it up. Any other questions? Okay, my lovely assistant says I have no other questions. So thank you so much. Have a good night. Be safe. Wash your hands. And hopefully we'll be able to see each other in person at an event in the future. Thanks. Good night.
Adelaide says